In this case, it's a mother's life is at jeopardy. So how does this work? Well, Thompson says, imagine. This is a new sort of made up scenario she offers. She says, imagine that you were in a house. And it's a tiny house. It's a small, confined house. Say it's like 150 square feet or 100 square feet. Maybe that's a big house, for some people. But just imagine, reduce the square footage to whatever you need it to be. And then imagine, now this is kind of sci-fi, kind of horror, sci-fi genre thought process. But imagine that you were in this house and there was a baby in the house with you. But this baby starts to grow. And they're growing like exponentially quickly. I mean, 1 minute, they weigh, they have a weight of say, 8 pounds. 1 minute after that, they're up to 80 pounds. And their bodies, expanding, as this happens. And you're in this house, you can't open the door. You can't escape. The walls are like super rigid. Imagine the walls are steel reinforced concrete or whatever you need. Where this is there is no escape from the house. You can't leave the house. And this child is getting just bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, everybody can predict the inevitability here that if this child continues to increase in size, eventually there's not going to be any room for you. That the child will get so big that you'll be smothered out, pressed up against the wall. Like their body is going to just crush you against the wall and you'll die. But you're trapped in a tiny house that you cannot escape from. You're in there with the child that's just growing to these exorbitant proportions. And it's happening quickly. And you can't escape the house. But what you can do is that say you have some weapon and you could kill the child and that would stop the growing. That would save your life. Would it be morally okay to kill that child in self-defense? You think about that. Thompson is going to say, yes, it would. Why? Because we have to be able to defend ourselves. It's like the child may have a right to life. You do too, though. And if the child is jeopardizing your life, which they clearly are in this growing child tiny house scenario, Thompson's intuition is that we couldn't just tell someone, no, it would be immoral to kill that child. No, you have to let yourself die so that this child may live. Assume that if the child, they get large enough that they'll have there'll be strength enough to break free of the house that the child will live. But you're going to be crushed against the wall well before that happens. The child may continue, but you won't. And so Thompson's question is, well, wouldn't it be okay to defend your own life? Or is it immoral to do anything to that child? Is one morally obligated to sacrifice themselves for that child? Thompson's intuition is saying no. No, because you could have, it's a child versus you're an adult. And you may have other children that depend on you. You have life projects, you have goals, you have a job, a career, you have all these other people that depend on you. And you, in a sense, have more at stake than the child. And even if you didn't, it would still, Thompson's going to sort of reason that, doesn't it still seem morally okay to act in self-defense? Or to Thompson's mind, it's like morality cannot force us to sacrifice ourselves in scenarios like this. That morality has to give us at least that little bit. That we can try to save ourselves. That we can't be immoral for just trying to live ourselves. especially if both parties equally have some form of right to life, whatever that means. If we each have rights to life, but I have all these other dependencies, all these other dependents and various things, and this child doesn't. I mean, doesn't it seem morally fair, at least, to defend yourself in such scenarios? Or does morality demand that one just sacrifice themselves for whatever, because it's a child? Is that why? Now, the analogous cases say that a person is pregnant and that there's complications in that pregnancy, and the mother's life is in jeopardy due to that pregnancy, that if the pregnancy is allowed to continue, the child would develop enough to actually live if they did, an emergency removal. But in that process, the child's pressing up against the mother's organs or various, parts in such ways that those organs are going to be in such low failure mode states that our contemporary medicine will not be able to save them. They won't be able to bring that person back. There's so much damage that's going to have to take place to the mother's body before the child is ready to be, can be extracted, that the mother's going to die. And so the question is, would it be okay for that mother to defend herself? To say, okay, yeah, it's not that I don't think the fetus, the infant has a right to life, but I have a right to life too. And the mother very likely will have other dependents, spouses or partners or whatever, maybe other children, that the adult is interwoven in a whole life story already, whereas the child is not yet woven that deeply into the story. And moreover, even if that's not the case, don't we have some entitlement or right to defend our own lives when they're threatened? Or does morality demand that all mothers that ever encounter this situation, which a certain percentage of people do across the globe, does morality demand that all of those women sacrifice themselves just so the baby can live? Thompson's intuition is to say no. It does not. The morality cannot be that stringent in these cases, that it has to leave room for us to defend our own lives. And so if it's okay, here's the way the argument by analogy works, that if it seems morally okay to end the life of the rapidly growing child in the tiny house in order to save yourself, in self-defense. You're not doing it because you're mean. You're not doing it out of some malicious intent. You're just doing it to save yourself. If it's morally okay to save yourself in the growing child tiny house scenario, then it should likewise be just as morally okay in cases of abortion where a mother's life is in jeopardy. It should be okay for that mother to save her own life in self-defense by ending the fetus's life through abortion. That's the way that an argument by analogy is supposed to work. Is that good? Well, an interesting thing about it is Thompson starts, this is the first moment where this notion starts getting sprinkled throughout her article. It shows up in a lot of places, but she says this is an interesting, a sort of thing to keep in mind is in the case of a mother's life is at jeopardy due to a pregnancy, is that the fetus is a guest. The mother is the house. It's the mother's body that's at stake here and life. That the fetus is a temporary resident inside the mother. And so is the mother supposed to allow the whole house to burn down just so that a temporary resident can live? The whole house, the analogy being her body. It's like the fetus doesn't own the body, the mother does. So there's this notion of ownership that starts to appear inside this article. Is that, that this is that beginning of this notion of bodily autonomy, is that we own our bodies. They're ours. That's why we have this ability, this right to control what happens within and to them. Is why? Is that your body is your body. My body is my body. And that's one of the things that makes it wrong for someone to forcibly do things to our bodies. Is why? Is because they're ours. They're not that other person's. Well, in this case, when a mother's life is at jeopardy, the mother owns the body, so she's like the landlord. She gets to make the call about the tenants, who gets to live in that body, especially if the tenant living in that body is going to kill her if it continues to do so. That's the thing. That's the way this sort of analogy works, is if it's okay to end the life of the rapidly growing child in a tiny house, if that's morally okay, then analogously it should be morally okay for mothers that find themselves in the situation of their life would have to be sacrificed in order for the infant to develop enough to be born. It should be just as moral to abort in those cases as it would be in the tiny house case, and vice versa. That's how this is supposed to work. So the first analogy is dealing with abortions in the case of rape. The second is mother's life is in jeopardy. And notice that if Thompson wins here, she's won the day. She does not, every one of these analogies doesn't have to work for Thompson to gain support for the claim that abortion is not always immoral. That's what each of these is just any one of them, if you buy it, that it's a good enough analogy, argument by analogy, to support that abortion is not always immoral, then Thompson's won. She's done what she wanted to do in the article, at least. Okay, this is the extremely interesting one, the celebrity's touch and a child's life's in jeopardy. This is where it gets even deeper. The celebrity's touch, in order to find it in the article, as Thompson talks about Henry Fonda, which that just shows, the date of the article, the early 70s, 70, 71, Henry Fonda was a popular celebrity style figure. Just pick any popular celebrity person of today that you can think of. Pick, say a Kardashian or something. It doesn't matter who you pick. Just whatever celebrity you can think of. You can say a president's touch. It doesn't matter. It could be anybody's touch, but Thompson uses Henry Fonda as a celebrity's touch. And so here's the scenario. She says, Thompson says, imagine that she was dying. That she was, this fever. And once again, this has an essence of sci-fi to it, but it doesn't have to be. Sci-fi-esque. It's just the way she does it. Is imagine that you were dying, I was dying, whoever, that we were dying, and we have this sort of fevered state, and it was determined that the only thing that's needed for us to continue to live is for this famous celebrity to come by and put their cool touch on our forehead. That's all that's needed. It's like the epitome, of hands-on healing, whatever you want to think of this. But all it takes is this one famous person that doesn't know you or me. They have no ties to you or me, but all it would take for our life to continue, we would be healed, is for that person to fly from, say, Los Angeles or wherever they are, and come over to where we are and just lay their hand on our forehead. And if they would do that, that's all it would take for us to continue to live. Well, let's start thinking about this in terms of the notion of a right to life. This is where Thompson's true strength lies in terms of truly clever argumentation. I'm not saying we have to buy into this, but it is a neat, clever way to think about the right to life. It's a neat question to raise about it. It's because people throw this notion of a right to life around all the time in abortion debates and a lot of other debates. But what does it really mean to have a right to life? That's what this celebrity touch and, life in jeopardy sort of scenario it raises. It raises this question of like, what is actually a right to life and what does it get us? Like, what does having a right to life entitle us to? What does it obligate others to do for us, if anything? Okay, so go back to the scenario. All we need is say that I'm near death's doorstep. I'm about to die, and all I need is a famous celebrity to fly over and put their hand on my forehead. Then I'll live. Well, I have a right to life. Let's assume I do. I have a right to life. Does having that right to life morally obligate that celebrity that does not know me? Is that person morally obligated to fly over from where they are and put their hand on me? Do they have to do that, or the alternative is that they are immoral? Say that we let them know that their touch is the only touch that would save us. Assume they know that. And assume, and so imagine they say no. Like, no, I'm not going to fly over there. Have they done something immoral? Thompson would want to say, no, they have not. And now, how does that work? Is that I have a right to life, though. And so, does having a right to life mean that a person has a right to use someone else's resources or their body in order to maintain that life? So, how would I be using the celebrity? Well, the celebrity has to touch me. Their touch. And that's their body. That's their resources. Do I have a claim on that person's body and resources? Just because I'm going to die if they don't touch me, do I have some entitlement to that person's touch? Is that person morally obligated, because I have a right to life, to actually give me what I need in order to maintain that life? Thompson wants to say no. And so let's go to a different, keep continuing with scenarios here. Imagine that I was, say, starving. And, I need some food. I don't have any, way to get this food. Say I'm starving, I'm injured in a way that I just can't get to where any food is. Does anybody else on this planet, are they morally obligated to give me their food so that I live? Not just buy me some food at the store. I'm saying they got to give me their own food. So they're going to go hungry for a night so that I'll continue to live for today. Just think about that. Everyone in the class, think about it. Is anyone morally obligated to give up their food so that you don't starve? Is anybody morally obligated, say, to give up their water so you don't starve? Is anybody obligated, say, you're going through, say, dual kidney failure or whatever? Is somebody else obligated to give you their kidneys? Say they're the only compatible match for you in the area. They've got some good kidneys. And to say it would kill them in order to give it to you. Or say that it wouldn't kill them. Say that you only need one of them. One of their lungs or, whatever. You just need one part. They have two. And it wouldn't kill them. Is anybody morally obligated? You will die without one lung. But they have two. They could live with just one lung. Not nearly as well as they did before, but neither of you will. But you'd both continue to live. But is anybody obligated? Say, I need a lung. How many people in this class, I'm going to assume you were going to die. And, because both of your lungs are just bad. And say there's somebody else that's a compatible match. They have two lungs. You could get one of their lungs. Is that person morally obligated to give you their lung? Thompson would say most everybody, their intuition should be no. that a person is not morally obligated to give over their bodily resources to someone just because that someone may have a right to life. That the right to life does not give one the additional right to use another's body or their body parts to maintain that life. So if I need someone else's lung to keep living and they don't want to give it to me, well, they haven't done anything immoral. Even if I did have a right to life, even if I'm a person. Why? Because having a right to life doesn't give me the extra right that I can use their body parts to keep me alive. Does it? That's Thompson. This is one of the most interesting arguments of all, this sort of analogy, because it really gets kind of deep about that notion of a right to life. What does a right to life actually entitle us to? Does it have any meaning at all? That's where Thompson's going with this, is to say, does saying that a fetus has a right to life, does that automatically entitle that fetus to use the mother's body to maintain that life? If we don't buy into the notion, say if the celebrity's touch analogy, is a little too weird for us, we can do it with this other analogy I just created with the lung sort of scenario or kidney scenario. Whatever body part you want to imagine that say you need it, you're going to die if you don't get it. Someone else has two. They're not going to die if they give you one of theirs, but say they don't want to give you theirs. Well, have they done something immoral because they don't want to give you their parts and they choose not to and you die? Thompson's going to say, absolutely not, they haven't. That just because one has a right to life doesn't mean you have a claim on somebody else's body parts if that's what's required to keep your life going. That person has bodily autonomy. They have a right to control what happens within and to their body. We do too, but they do. And so having a right to life is not good enough to go and say, oh, you got to give me your extra lung there, buddy, or your extra kidney. Because that person can always say no. That's the same thing, think about it, as if, would it say that we ask the person, they say no? Well, would we be acting morally if we just broke into their house at night and did the surgery and took the kidney we needed, and they wake up in the morning and they're missing a kidney, but we have it now? Would we have done something? Would we have violated that person? Or would we have been perfectly within our moral rights because we have a right to life to go in there and, pull out their kidney and take it for ourselves? Thompson would say we would be terribly immoral if we did that because that person has this right to bodily autonomy. We can't just use their kidney just because we need it to live. They have to grant us permission to do that. They have to agree to do that. And if they don't agree, well, just because we may have a right to life, that does not give us the right to use their body parts or forcibly take them from them in order to maintain that life. Well, how does that work with abortion? Well, as one might predict, a child's life is always in jeopardy during a pregnancy. That child's life is dependent on the mother's body and the usage of its, nutrient system, the respiratory system, the filtration system, kidneys, liver, all of that. That the child that's forming the fetus, its whole life depends on the mother using the mother's stuff. Well, what if the mother don't want it to use it? For whatever reason. How is that any different than if somebody has a lung or celebrity has the touch that we need to continue to live and they say no? And, Thompson's going to say by now we should be pretty clear that if they say no, they haven't really done anything immoral to us. It may be indecent. It may not be nice that they didn't say yes to our request for their extra kidney or their touch. But they didn't do anything immoral. So why wouldn't it be the case with the mother if she just says, no, I don't want the fetus to use my kidneys and my lung and my nutrition system. I don't want that. shouldn't the mother have the right to bodily autonomy to say no and not have done anything immoral? And moreover, just because the fetus may have a right to life, as Thompson would think we should be convinced of by this point, just because the fetus has a right to life, even if it's a person, none of that gives it the additional right to use someone else's body parts to maintain that life. If that person doesn't want you to use those body parts, that's the end of it. It's not like having a right to life obligates you or me to give up a kidney for someone else, or if it's a mother to give over, partial usage of all of her body to a newborn, to a fetus. That's the way this analogy is supposed to work. Cases, pregnancies where a child's life is in jeopardy is all pregnancies. This is pregnancies across the board, because the child's life is at jeopardy if they're not using the mother's body stuff, especially in these early stages. Assume it's before the child can live outside the body. Assume it's prior to that point. That's necessary for this to work. But that doesn't seem unreasonable. There's a long gestation period. So a child's life is always in jeopardy, or a fetus's life is always in jeopardy in all the early parts of pregnancy. So this should be analogous to any part of that, say the first 3/4 of the average gestation cycle, up to 4 or 5 or so months, or maybe more. And so that's how that analogy is supposed to work. If we cannot, it's kind of like you have to buy into the idea that having a right to life doesn't give someone, it doesn't entitle that person to use someone else's body to maintain their life. If you do buy into that, well, then Thompson's going to say, well, why wouldn't we think the same thing applies in the case of any pregnancy at all? In terms of if a child has a right to life, that's pretty much irrelevant to whether you agree to let them use your body or not. If you say no, you haven't done anything immoral. Why? Because you have bodily autonomy. And they're in your body. Remember, the mother owns the house. It's the mother's body. It's not the child's. The child's a visitor. They're a guest. According to Thompson. I'm not saying Thompson's right about this stuff. I'm just saying this is the way the reasoning's going. So this would be the case of pretty much all pregnancies, normal pregnancies or abnormal. It would apply to all of them. But it's a truly interesting way. That notion of right to life may not entitle us to use others' body parts to maintain our life. That is a truly unique Judith Jarvis Thompson idea that's often forgotten about. People don't tend to talk about this nearly as much as they do, say, this violinist case. But let's keep going. In these cases, this is supposed to be abortions in the case of like someone agrees to have sex, but they use protective contraceptive measures. So the question is, might it be morally okay to abort in a case where a couple agreed to have intercourse, sexual relations, and they used contraceptives, say birth control, condoms, whatever. The two people agreed to have sex, they used these various protective measures, but those measures failed, and now pregnancy is present. Would it be morally okay to abort at that point? Well, Thompson says, okay, imagine that you have your house and you put bars on the window. And you put bars on the window and you open one of the windows, but you still have your bars on there. And you open your door, but you got a bars, like some people have those screen bar doors on the front. But you open one door to your house and you open the window, but you have the bars in place. And yet a burglar, is crafty and clever, and they bypass the bars and they get in your house. At that point, are you morally obligated to let that person stay in your house and live there for a day, a month, 9 months? Just because you opened your doors, you still had bars, didn't you? Yeah, you put bars up. The bars were a good sign of what? You're not invited in. It's like you opened your door and your windows. Yes, you did. But did you invite burglars into your house? Most people, what would our intuition be? No, I had bars up, right? That's what Thompson. That's how she wants your mind to go with this sort of scenario, is to say, just because I open the door and my windows, as long as I still have my bars out, that does not extend an invitation to any invaders. These unwanted guests, like burglars, whoever's going to break into my house. I put these defensive screens out there, and yet they came in anyway. Now, I'm not what Thompson wants you to say. Well, I'm not morally required to take care and feed the burglar, am I? Then just think about it in terms of your own house. Say you build your house, you put bars on the windows, the doors, but you open your window, during the summertime to let some wind come through the house. You open your door, but you have your bars. That's still in place. You don't open the outside barred screen door and you don't, change the bars on the windows. Wouldn't most people say that you've still not invited any thieves or burglars or invaders in? That if you were inviting them in, wouldn't you have removed the bars? Thompson's idea is, if you think that you are not, and so say that they do break in, then the question is, are you morally obligated to feed them for 9 months? You didn't invite them in because you had the bars out there. So they're not invited, and you shouldn't have to feed them, should you? You shouldn't have to take care of them for 9 months. If you buy into that sort of reasoning, Thompson's going to say, well, then you should buy into the idea that if people voluntarily open themselves to just sex, but they use protection, then they're not inviting the new fetus in. They're not inviting the pregnancy. The very use of the contraceptives, just like the bars on the windows, is a big statement to the world. You're not wanted here, in terms of the fetus, the potential pregnancy. Sure, it's not 100%, just like bars on windows of houses are not 100%. But the idea is we should be able to open our doors and our windows, shouldn't we? And if we have bars on the windows, people should take the hint, like, that you're not invited in. And we certainly should never be morally obligated to have to take care of them if they happen to break in. And then we've got to feed them, tend to them, let them use our body for all these months to maintain their life when we didn't want them in the first place. Thompson's going to say, if it seems morally okay to kick out the burglar, then it should seem morally okay to abort the fetus. In cases where a couple voluntarily opts into sex, they open themselves to sex, but they used bars, they used birth control, they used various contraceptives. That was their big saying no to pregnancy. You're not invited. And so if, a fetus happens to form, like biology is crafty and clever and makes it past all of these bars and the windows, they're still not invited. And so shouldn't a person still be able to say, no, I don't want you in my house, leave? And then that's analogous to an abortion. And if it's morally okay to force the burglars to leave when you had bars on the windows, Thompson wants to say it should be equally morally okay to abort unwanted fetus development after you were using contraceptives. And the analogy is the same way. It just gets a little weirder with this window screens and people seeds. Like imagine you have window screens up but then there's these people seeds that are drifting through the wind, and they make it through the holes in your screen, and then they're in there and they say, oh, you've got a person starts forming, and that person says, oh, you've got to take care of me for 9 months and the rest of my life, potentially. And would it be okay for you to say no? Thompson wants to say yes. It would be perfectly fine for you to say no. Why? Because this is your house. This is your body. They were not invited in, even if you opened the doors. If you had screens up, you were not inviting the floating people seeds in. That in order to have some claim on the usage of your body, your house, as the analogy's using in this case, the person or the fetus has to be invited in. And if you put up bars and screens on the windows, use contraceptives, in other words, then you're not inviting them in. So they have no claim on using your biology to maintain their life. Even if they have a right to life, they do not obligate you to maintain that life. Okay, and then now here's this final thing, is this box of chocolates and voluntary unprotected sex. So say that maybe you buy into the case of people who use contraceptives, they didn't invite the pregnancy, they should still be able to use bodily autonomy and say, no, you're not invited, so it's morally okay to abort. But what about when they didn't use any protection at all? This is an interesting case. This is a case where no protection, totally voluntary, there's no forced, situation. Two people just decided to have intercourse. They didn't use any protection. Pregnancy followed. Well, should they be morally obligated to not abort, to carry fetus to term? Thompson's going to say no. How does that work? Well, this box of chocolates analogy is, imagine that you are sitting, in a room, someone else is sitting in a room. That person is given a box of chocolates, and it's more than they can eat, and you really want some chocolates. But that person says, no, you can't have my chocolates. And it wouldn't put them out, really, to give you some chocolates. But they say no. And it's their chocolates, right? Did they do anything immoral by telling you no? Just think about it. Think about a box of chocolates. It doesn't matter. Say that you're sitting in a room with somebody else. Say, that person, another person walks in and hands this person across from you like this big bottle of water. And you're sitting over there on the other side of the room and you're just dehydrated. You just want a sip of the water, and you ask them, can I just have a small sip of your water? I have this empty cup. Would you pour just a little of that water in this cup? And then that person says, no, I don't think so. Did that person act immorally toward you? It was their water, right? The chocolates, the water were theirs, given to them. And they just tell you no. Now, would they have done anything immoral? Thompson's going to say no. They didn't act immorally. They may have acted mean to you. They may have been mean to you. They may have been indecent to you. That it seems very callous and selfish and not nice. Just not nice. That especially given they didn't need all the water. They didn't need all the chocolates. And you just wanted a little. It wouldn't have put them out. But they tell you no. Thompson's going to say they may have been mean, they may have been callous, they may have been insensitive, and even indecent. But indecency is not equal to immorality. Just because a person doesn't do what another person would like for them to do, even if it doesn't put out the person, really all that much, it doesn't make the person's actions immoral. Just because they tell us no doesn't mean they were immoral to us. They may have been mean to us. They may have been not nice to us. They may have been indecent to us. but they are not immoral for simply telling us no. Why? Because it was their chocolates. It's their water. It's their stuff. It's not our stuff. If they tell us no, fine. Analogously, in this case of voluntary unprotected sex, the two people didn't do anything to prevent the pregnancy, but there's still this base reality that Thompson would want us to see, is that at the end of the day, the woman's body in this case, the potential mother's body in this case, is still her body. And if she does not want to share that body with that fetus, it doesn't matter if there would be no health complications. It doesn't matter if there would be no long-lasting effects. Like, say, all the fetus needs is the 9 months, then it can be given over for adoption, for example, which that's not a quick process by any means. No one ever needs to think that adoption's easy or simple in either direction, by the way. That's something to realize. A lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, well, they can give it over to adoption. Yeah, that's not easy to do. It can be pretty straightforward depending on the state you're in or the country you're in. But it can be very complicated too. And moreover, when one gives over to adoption, that's isn't that the same as having other people take care of a child that this person made themselves, But either way, without getting in all the political, legal, sort of even moral ideas there, the simple thing is assume that the fetus isn't asking for any more but just the 9 months. After that, it'll go off on its own. Thompson's going to say, even if that is the case, there is that undeniable reality. Even if the sex was unprotected, even if it was voluntary, the body is still the mother's body. She, just like those chocolates, it may be mean, it may be selfish, it may be callous, it may even be morally indecent for a mother to refuse a fetus's usage of her body for just that gestation period, just that 9 months. It may be indecent for her to refuse, but indecency does not equal immorality. Thus, it's okay to abort in cases even when the sex was voluntary and unprotected. Why? Because, once again, that mother's right to bodily autonomy. Then the mother owns the body, just like in this case, the other person owns the chocolates. It's on them if they decide to grant us some. Just like it's on the mother to decide whether she wants the fetus to be able to use her body or not. If she says no, she says no. She's not done anything immoral. According to Thompson, that's the way this argument by analogy is supposed to work anyway. Interesting. Moral indecency, meanness, selfishness, if that's what it is. I'm not saying it is. These are Thompson's words. Keep that in mind. This is not Stephen. This is Thompson. But the main hallmark of this example is that a person can be really morally indecent to you, but that does not mean they have been immoral to you. It doesn't mean they've done something wrong to you. Even if it would have been simple enough for them to do for you, they didn't really have much to lose by doing it for you. If just because they tell you no, that doesn't mean that they have acted immorally toward you. Maybe they were mean, maybe they were not nice to you, but that doesn't mean immoral. And so that's how it's supposed to work in that case. And then that ties into this Good Samaritans versus minimally decent Samaritans. It's an interesting thing, discussion that happens near the end of her article. In the end, all we really need to know about this is that Thompson would say it's fine if people want to be Good Samaritans. If they find themselves pregnant and they want to give over 9 months for the rest of their lives to raise a child and to have, the child during the gestation period, to, give birth to the child, to take care of the child, it's fine. If someone wants to do that, if a mother wants to sacrifice herself, her life, so that the baby will live, that's fine too. Those would be the notion of a good Samaritan. There's someone that went above and beyond. They didn't have to do that. Morality does not require, or ethics doesn't require, according to Thompson now, that we go above and beyond. All it requires is that we don't do things that are wrong. Well, nothing says we have to just go out of our way to do good stuff. If you want to do good stuff and be a good Samaritan, fine. If you don't want to go out of your way, as long as you don't do anything wrong, you're not immoral. And Thompson would say, you're not even, morality doesn't even require that we're minimally decent Samaritans. Remember, it's not immoral to be mean. It's not immoral to tell someone no just because you don't want to give something of yours up to them. You haven't done anything immoral by simply saying, no, this is mine, not yours, and you can't have it. That doesn't make you immoral, according to Thompson. A minimally decent Samaritan would say, well, you only have to carry the fetus for this time period, then you can give it away. Thompson's going to say, that's fine. If a person wants to do that, that's fine. But they're not morally obligated to. Unless the child has some right or claim that trumps the mother's right to bodily autonomy, which Thompson leaves open that possibility that those kind of cases may arise at times. She just thinks that they're not all that. They're not the sort of cases that they're typically talking about in the abortion debate. Abortion debates, you'll typically hear about people who talk about, well, is it morally okay to abort in a case where rape occurred? Or is it morally okay to abort when a mother's life is in jeopardy? Or is it morally okay to abort when sex occurred, but contraceptives were being used? And it was voluntary. Or is it okay to abort in cases where the sex was voluntary and no protection was used? And so these are the big cases. These are the big sort of grandiose sort of categories that abortion tends to show up in. It can show up in others, though, and Thompson acknowledges that. But the overall take-home message with Thompson is that the default assumption is that the mother's right to bodily autonomy is most always going to trump any rights or claims or entitlements that a fetus would have. And why would you buy into that? Well, all of these argument by analogy she's offered. So her finale argument, or what one could call the finale argument, Thompson mentions pieces of this throughout the whole article. As you're reading it, you'll see them. But just to summarize it, the finale argument would be something like, while fetuses may be persons and have a right to life, mothers definitely have a right to control what happens within and to their bodies. Fetuses may be persons. Remember, Thompson just said we will assume that that's true, but she didn't actually buy it. She said, even if we assume that fetuses are persons, even if we assume they have a right to life, that's still tenuous. That's still a maybe. Thompson's going to say, we don't know, because we don't really know what personhood is. And the notion of a right to life, as we've seen, may not really mean a whole lot at all. And so those things may be in place. We don't know. But even if they are in place, the one thing we do know, according to Thompson, is that mothers definitely have a right to control what happens within and to their bodies. Everybody has that. That's the right to bodily autonomy. Every adult person, a person that has a mind and can think and stuff, has this. Autonomy demands, an awareness. In order to have autonomy, you have to have a mind, where you can think, make choices of your own. That's the notion of this control. It has to be an ability to consciously make decisions and control. So this right to bodily autonomy pretty much only comes into play as one's mind comes into play in a pretty robust sense about making choices, willing things to happen. And so she says, well, we know that all people, mothers, fathers, everybody adult person has this right to bodily autonomy. We're not sure if fetuses or persons have a right to life, but we do know that adult people have a right to bodily autonomy. Well, it's always morally okay to exercise one's rights. That's just a sort of default assumption in ethics and legal context, is that if you have a right, well, the idea you have the right, you should be able to exercise it without doing anything wrong. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward. Now, there may be limits on your ability to exercise that right, but typically the default assumption is if you have a right, you should be able to exercise it without too much trouble, which may or may not be true in practice, but it's the way the ideal is supposed to work. And so mothers, fathers, everybody, all adults have a right to bodily autonomy. It's always morally okay to exercise any moral rights one has. In a majority of cases, abortions are simply cases where a mother is exercising her right to bodily autonomy. Thus, abortion is moral in a majority of cases. That's the big sort of overarching argument. That each of these things, this in a majority of cases, abortions are simply this reason or premise 3 is supported by all of these analogies and supportive reasoning that I've added in as I've talked through them. All of these cases here, these made-up cases and what they're supposedly analogous to in the abortion scenario, all of that goes in to support reason 3 right there. And so that's our argument. Everyone's thoughts about Thompson. Well, we will have the opportunity, everyone will, to think through this during this week's discussion. I won't go into, I think that I've given enough so that people can kind of understand what's happening with Thompson. I think we've already taken care of an understanding step, and analysis will occur during this week's discussion about these various analogies and arguments by analogy. But let's move on to the next person. Either way, Thompson's really interesting, and a lot of times what you'll encounter out in the wild of the internet or books is people mainly only ever focus on this violinist and rape sort of argument by analogy, but Thompson's other analogies are way more interesting. In many ways, this one's kind of the easy one. And, in my view it is, but my view could be mistaken. But these are the really neat ones. All of these, celebrities touch, growing child. And I've given everybody enough alternative sort of analogies to see that they don't have to be totally just made up weird things. That you can make them more realistic if you need to understand them. Okay, on to Marquis. We will not say as much about Marquis as we have about Thompson, because Marquis' article is a lot more straightforward. So it doesn't take as much time to kind of talk through. Is that in terms of values and disvalues, Marquis values life and living. That's like his big prime value. Is that life and all the meaningful experiences and goals and projects and the meaningful anythings that life can hold and contain. To Marquis, that is something that is so valuable. It's what makes life worth having. Life is worthwhile. Why? Because of all these meaningful experiences and things we can do in it. It's what life makes available to us. That is what makes life valuable. All the various things we can get caught up in and spend our time and enjoy. All of that. That's what makes life so awesome and worthwhile. And Marquis values that aspect of life. And he disvalues, anything that would prematurely terminate our lives. Things that end all this wonderful, worthwhile stuff that we could do if we were to continue to live. Anything that gets in the way of living, that's disvalued. That's not all that worthwhile. That's the kind of stuff we want to minimize. We want to maximize life. We want to minimize things that would prematurely end lives. But what does all that mean? Let's move forward. These are just the core things. These are Marquis's sort of motivation. These are the values and disvalues that Marquis, these are driving his reasoning. So Marquis claims that most abortions are immoral, not because fetuses are persons, but instead because killing is wrong. So Marquis has an argumentative strategy. Remember, at the very first of this video, I kind of said a lot about having a strategy of how to enter the abortion debate is crucially important. You can't go in it without some sort of clever way of approaching it. Thompson approaches it in terms of, I'll give my opponents everything they want and still show that they don't get the conclusion they want. Marquis approaches it, abortion, in terms of abortion is derivatively wrong. What makes abortion wrong is that killing is wrong. So Marquis develops a theory of why killing is wrong. And then he says abortion's a form of killing. That's what makes abortion wrong. But it's not like abortion is not just wrong in and of itself. No, abortion is wrong because it involves killing. And killing is what's really, really wrong. That's the bad thing, is the killing. So Marquis is obligated to provide us with some account of, or a theory of, what makes killing wrong. That's kind of interesting. You know, strategically, that's an interesting way, is that you build a whole theory of why killing is wrong so that you can later down the line say, oh yeah, and abortion's a form of killing, so that's why it's wrong. It's neat. So the majority of the article is him developing and defending this sort of theory of why killing is so terribly bad. The first thing to note about his theory is it's what's often referred to as a deprivation theory. It's like a deprivation theory is you say that something is bad or it's evil or it's not as good as it could be because of what that thing deprives us of, what it takes away. You know, what we could have had that by that event happening we now don't have or won't have. What we're deprived of is what makes something bad. Yeah, and you can see that. A neat account of it that we can see in this week's one of the signed articles is Nagel on death. And Nagel tries to explain why death may be a bad thing or an evil thing. You know, he's using the notion of evil just to mean bad. But the idea is, why might death be bad? Well, because of what it deprives us of. So Nagel gives a sort of deprivation theory of death, which that's relevant to this week when we're talking about abortion, which involves death. And so it seems like abortion is often thought to be bad because it involves dying. But what if death isn't so bad? Well, Nagel's going to give us some reasons to think, yeah, death may be pretty bad. but either way, I mean, a case could be made that perhaps death isn't so bad, and Nagel actually kind of looks at some of those possibilities. So it's an assumption that runs throughout all the abortion debate. That's why we have this Nagel article to look at, is that abortion is assumed to be bad because it involves a death. You know, a fetus's death. But what if death isn't a bad thing? Well, then would abortion still be bad if death isn't bad? It's an interesting sort of way to question a fundamental thing, an assumption. It's assumed that death is bad in the abortion debate. But what if it's not? Well, Nagel kind of thinks through that. So it gives you another angle to kind of think about the abortion debate. We're not going to emphasize this too much this week, but it's definitely, we want everyone to want to read it just to get that extra sort of way of thinking. Okay, that being said, well, how does Marquis' deprivation theory of the wrongness of killing work? Well, it's pretty simple. Killing is bad or wrong because it deprives the person that's being killed or that has been killed of all the valuable and consciously meaningful projects, goals, dreams, ambitions, experiences, etc. that the person would or could have had if if he or she had not been killed. And Marquis refers to this valuable stuff, these consciously meaningful projects, as a person's future like ours. It's sometimes Marquis' theory of the wrongness of killing is sometimes called a flow theory, the future like ours theory. And so the core idea is that what makes killing something bad? What's bad about killing a living being is that it takes away all of the opportunities they would have had were they to have continued to live. You take away their future. That's what makes killing bad, according to a theory like Marquis, is it deprives that living creature of the life they would have had and all the really awesome stuff that comes with that life. Assuming there's all this awesome stuff that would have arrived, that could have arrived in their life. It's not that the living creature would have necessarily had a good life. It's that they could have had one. If they were to have lived, they had the potential to have a good life. They could have had experiences that we value, like being able to have a job, have a career, have a family, be able to figure out how to beat the video game that one's been working on for 3 months. Any of these things, these great moments of happiness, of sadness, of compassion, of excitement, of joy. All of these extremely valuable experiences and meaningful experiences are taken away. The opportunity to experience those things is taken away when the individual is killed. They are robbed of a future like ours. That a deprivation theory, you can also think of it as a sort of steal theory. That what makes killing wrong is what it steals from the person that's killed. Their future is stolen and taken away from them. And we hear this in the news when they talk about murder and various things. I'm sure people in here are familiar with the phrase of their life was stolen too soon. Well, this is an actual explanation of what that actually means. When we say, what is it that is stolen? We're saying what has been deprived, what's been taken away, what has been lost. And Marquis, he does a cool job of giving lots of kind of examples of these things and really putting forward a lot of sort of cool reasoning for why losing life is terrible. And that if someone intentionally kills someone and takes that flow away, that future like ours, all those valuable experiences, that's why we think they've done something wrong. He's given us an explanation for why the typical person would consider killing to be a bad thing. It's a bad thing because of what it deprives the living creature that was killed of. And so for Marquis, it's not that killing is wrong because it violates some abstract right to life. See, remember, Marquis, like Thompson, personhood, right to life, to him, that's not what's as important. Killing is wrong not because it violates personhood or right to life. Killing is wrong because it's not what you had, like a right to life or personhood before you were killed, that matters. It's what you would have had that you now will not have. It's what was robbed from you, taken from you by being killed. It's your future. The loss of a future is what makes killing someone wrong, not the fact that they may or may not have had a right to life. See, for Marquis, it's the same way as Thompson. Right to life really doesn't mean anything. And keep in mind, the right to life is thrown around debates all the time. But here's the second arguer that is trying to give us their best case for thinking, yeah, right to life really isn't that helpful at all. It doesn't really help us. It's not really saying anything. But what does say something is Why is killing wrong? It's wrong because it's robbing someone of a future they would or could have had they continued to live. And so then how does that tie to abortion? Well, pretty straightforward. Killing someone is very wrong or immoral. This is a summation of Marquis' argument. I mean, this is just a brief summation. You can add this in and be more charitable. But it's just gets to the core of his argument. Is killing someone is very wrong or immoral because it deprives that individual of a flow, future like ours. Abortion involves killing a fetus that has a flow. I mean, a fetus could or would have had all kinds of future experiences, meaningful stuff. Well, then abortion, like killing, is very moral or wrong. If what makes killing wrong is the deprivation of a flow, an individual's flow, and abortion involves killing a fetus, which is going to deprive that fetus of a flow, then abortion, like killing, has to be equally as wrong. That's Marquis' argument. Whether you buy into it or not, that's for everyone in here to think about. But it's an interesting argument either way. And so wiggle room. Note that in Marquis' argument here, that if a fetus was determined not to have a flow, like say that we're dealing with a fetus that we did a lot, various medical testing, and it was noticed that this is a human organism, but it won't have a brain. It's like anencephalic or something. And the idea is, well, you have to have consciousness in order to develop meaningful experiences. Someone like Marquis would assume that anyway, that you got to have some form of mind in conscious awareness and involvement, the mental capacity to become involved and concerned about life and living. Those are like minimum requirements for his notion of a flow. Remember, it's consciously meaningful projects, goals, dreams, ambitions. Well, you pretty much have to have a mind in order to have things like that. And that means you got to have some form of a brain in the human being, at least. Mind might not be totally just the brain. There may be way more to it than just the brain, but you got to have a brain to at least get started with a mind. That's the sort of typical, just default assumption. And so a fetus that was found to not have a brain, the case could be made that fetus really doesn't have a flow. And if it did, like a future like ours, it may not. And if it doesn't, well, then it may be totally morally okay to abort. Marquis is a little wish-wash about this, but he does seem to leave a little bit of room that if it could be medically determined or scientifically determined that a particular fetus does not have any hope whatsoever due to a lack of a brain or too much brain damage or whatever to have a flow, well, then it may very well, morality may not balk too much if we were to abort it. That's Marquis. I'm not saying he's right or wrong about this. That's just the sort of wiggle that's left in this argument, given the way that second reason works. Abortion involves killing a fetus with a flow. But if you happen to find a fetus due to, some biologic mutation or lack, that would never have a flow, then abortion wouldn't involve killing a fetus with a flow. It may involve killing a fetus, but if it doesn't have a flow, then this argument isn't going to say it's immoral. Just something to think about. Now, at this stage, we've worked through the first 5 stages of the sort of philosophical pattern of inquiry, but I've also been working on the stage 6 the whole time, helping everyone kind of understand Thompson's analogies and Marquis, what he's up to. So everyone should now have enough to be able to read Thompson and Marquis' articles for this week and to think about them, and check out the various stuff in the voluntary submodule for this week. There's one a video link in the voluntary stuff this week for a professor at Biola that kind of goes on the attack against Thompson, gives you a sort of counter way of thinking about, Thompson's violinist analogy. There's a lot of cool stuff, and there's more talk about what does it mean to have rights. That's all in this week's voluntary module. I encourage people, check some of that stuff out as we go through the semester. It can enhance what, we're focused on in the main part of the module. It can enhance everything. in analysis and decision, we will work with that during this week's discussion. I hope this video has been helpful. Just definitely let me know. Send me an email or ask me questions about it. I hope that it helps people kind of be able to work through Thompson and Marquis. It'll take some time, some thought to work through carefully through their articles, but you should have enough for after this video to be able to make sense of it and go forward and think about it. It's really neat maneuvering as far as reasoning goes this week. Marquis and Thompson are both very good examples of how one can use an argumentative strategy and systematically follow it to try to support conclusions with, reasoning that builds on top of itself as it goes along. There's a lot of good stuff that one can find in this week's readings. But until this week's discussion, I'll talk with everyone a little later.